December 1944, Ardennes Forest, Belgium, settled over the Ardennes like a heavy curtain, dimming every field, every tree line, and every farmhouse scattered across the Belgian countryside. The German border lay only a few miles east, hidden behind ridge lines and spruce forests pressed under fresh snow. In this season, dawn did not break. It leaked slowly into the world, a pale gray seepage that revealed the same abandoned stillness stretching from village to village. The cold didn't merely lower temperature, it shaped the battlefield, hardened the earth, stiffened limbs, and erased sound until movement felt like trespass. Into this landscape moved Private First Class Arthur Art Jonke of the 82nd Airborne Division, a paratrooper accustomed to operating behind enemy lines, but not accustomed to the isolation he now carried. The Ardennes had become a shifting front of half-seen shapes and distant engine noises, a battlefield where a soldier could march 10 minutes in the wrong direction and find himself standing alone between two armies. Jonke knew this because he was already living it. The night before, his platoon had pulled back through a narrow woodland corridor north of the Salm River, pressured by German infantry pushing west with unexpected coordination. Patrols became separated. Snowfall thickened. Radio contact faded under atmospheric interference. And as the units repositioned, the terrain swallowed their cohesion. By dawn, the 82nd's line resembled a broken ridge of scattered strongpoints more than an organized defensive sector. Jonke had survived worse conditions. Normandy had introduced him to fog that clung to the ground in sheets thick enough to hide entire companies. Holland had shown him what happened when paratroopers fought armor in open fields. But Belgium's winter carried a precision that neither front had matched. The cold entered his boots and stayed there. The wind cut beneath the rim of his M1 helmet with the soft persistence of a blade. Every exhaled breath crystallized and drifted sideways in a slow-moving haze that felt almost unnatural. The landscape reflected the same harsh geometry. The Ardennes was not a forest in the cinematic sense. It was a series of ridges broken by farmland dotted with modest stone farmhouses and barns shaped by decades of harsh seasons. Snow muffled every contour, turning hedgerows into deceptive, rolling lines that could conceal infantry, machine gun nests, or the first probing elements of German armored spearheads. What unsettled Jonke most was the silence. Not the calm silence of a quiet morning, but the kind that suggested distant movement. Muted artillery, engines idling behind a tree line, boots crunching snow at intervals too irregular to be wind. The Battle of the Bulge had begun 3 days earlier, and the Germans were pushing with an audacity that defied the season. In this offensive, nothing moved alone. No patrol returned small. No sound represented only one threat. Yet here he was, a lone American paratrooper threading across a white field bordered by fir trees, separated from his platoon, navigating by memory and instinct. He paused at the crest of a shallow rise, lowered himself into a crouch, and studied the terrain ahead. 200 yards away sat an isolated Belgian farmhouse. Stone walls, slate roof, small windows half clogged with frost, a barn attached on the right, a courtyard partially shielded by a low stone wall. Smoke no longer rose from the chimney. Tracks in the snow indicated multiple parties had recently moved around it. He understood instantly what that meant. The farmhouse was no longer merely a structure. It was a piece of contested ground in the middle of shifting lines. Whoever held it controlled observation over the next 2 fields, a small road cutting north, and a natural funnel between 2 thick stands of spruce trees. It was the kind of position small units on both sides fought to occupy during rapid winter advances. And it was the kind of building a single paratrooper could defend, if he had no alternative. The distant crack of a rifle carried across the frozen air, followed by a short burst of automatic fire. The sound did not resolve into clarity. The snow absorbed it, scattering the direction. But to Jonke it carried a familiar message. The Germans were closer than the silence suggested. He rose, tightened the strap on his M1 Garand, and began moving toward the farmhouse. Not hurriedly. Haste left patterns in snow that gave away a man's direction, but with steady, deliberate steps that left clean impressions. He scanned the roofline for movement. the upper windows for silhouettes, the barn doors for unnatural shadows. Nothing moved. No vapor slipped from broken glass. No footprints cut fresh paths across the courtyard. The building appeared abandoned. He knew better than to trust appearances. By the time he reached the western wall, he could sense the shift in the air, the faint pressure of proximity, the instinct that told experienced soldiers when the unseen battlefield was rearranging itself. A low ridge to the east blocked the road. Dense spruce trees channeled movement from the north. Sparks of light flickered behind the trees, small reflections of metal on the move. He circled the farmhouse, pushed the door open with the barrel of his rifle, and stepped inside. Cold stone, dust, a table overturned, shell casings in a corner, marks on the floor where boots had scraped during a struggle. Every detail suggested that another unit, American or German, had used this place recently, but the silence inside the thick walls was deeper than outside. It carried weight. A farmhouse in enemy territory could become a death trap, but it could also become the one defensible strongpoint a lone paratrooper needed to turn separation into survival. He closed the door softly. The storm was coming, and he would meet it alone. The farmhouse stood on ground that had changed owners too many times in too few days. The Ardennes offensive had turned tranquil Belgian farmland into a shifting front, where units vanished into fog, only to reappear miles from where they were expected. The 82nd Airborne Division, brought into the line as a mobile fire brigade, found itself fighting a battle that had not been scripted for paratroopers. Yet the division's reputation for absorbing the unexpected had placed them directly in the path of the German advance. The roots of this moment, a single American paratrooper alone inside a farmhouse, stretched far beyond the frozen fields surrounding him. They reached back to Allied decisions made in warm rooms in Paris and Brussels, to German desperation forged in the industrial ruins of the Reich, and to a winter offensive planned with a level of secrecy that stunned even those who understood German military doctrine. Hitler's final gamble, Operation Wacht im Rhein, had been conceived as a lightning stroke designed to fracture the Allied front, seize key road junctions, and push all the way to Antwerp. The operation required weather that grounded Allied aircraft. It required surprise so complete that divisions like the 82nd would be pulled from reserve positions into the line before they understood the scale of the oncoming forces. And it required terrain like the Ardennes, ridgelines, tight road networks, farmhouses turned into strong points, to channel American movement into predictable corridors. For the Germans, the Ardennes was not simply a forest, it was a funnel with potential. For the Americans, it was a quiet sector where divisions rested and reorganized. That difference in perception shaped every confrontation across the snow-covered region. By the time the German offensive began on December 16th, the 82nd Airborne was positioned north of Bastogne, covering approaches to the Salm River. The paratroopers had fought difficult campaigns already that year, Normandy in the summer, Holland in the autumn. Many were exhausted, carrying injuries that hadn't fully healed, operating with reduced strength, but experience had refined them into soldiers who reacted to disorientation with instinct rather than panic. Arthur Janke was part of that cadre. He had jumped into Normandy under a sky littered with tracer fire, landing far from his intended drop zone. He had fought in Holland across flat farmland where German armor roamed with predatory confidence. And he entered the Ardennes with a familiarity for chaos that few other American divisions could match. His platoon had been conducting reconnaissance when the first German shockwaves began rolling across the front. The 82nd's response was swift, but the terrain worked against them. The region's farms and villages created isolated pockets of resistance separated by forests, where visibility narrowed to 20 yards, sometimes less. Radios struggled in the weather. Patrols became separated by snow squalls that moved like drifting walls. Units fighting along the same line often believed they were the last ones holding. In this environment, German infantry, especially Volksgrenadiers trained for winter operations, moved with an aggressiveness that belied their inconsistent equipment. They carried Panzerfausts in numbers that surprised American officers. They advanced behind smoke that clung to the low terrain. They fired from positions invisible in the snow until the muzzle flash betrayed them. Janke's platoon encountered one such German probing force the night before he reached the farmhouse. It had not been a disastrous engagement, but the confusion of the fight, combined with the darkness and the swirling snowfall, fractured the American formation. As the platoon withdrew to re-establish a line, the forest swallowed visibility. Men disappeared into the terrain, as if absorbed by it. The snow-covered ground carried no sound, and the drifting wind masked direction. Janki moved with the withdrawal, until a small rise separated him from the others. He attempted to loop back, but the sound of German rifle fire forced him to shift course. The Ardennes could create isolation in minutes. The farmhouse he now occupied had likely served multiple military roles over the previous 48 hours. The American 106th Infantry Division, battered heavily in the opening days of the German offensive, had fought delaying actions nearby. Elements of the 3rd Armored Division had probed this region. German patrols had passed through, searching for weak points. The building's thick stone walls made it valuable to anyone needing cover from small arms fire, and its location, positioned between two tree lines and overlooking shallow open fields, granted a defender a brief but important advantage. Inside, Janki examined the structure with the practiced eye of a paratrooper trained to convert any building into a fighting position. The kitchen offered little. The upstairs rooms faced the wrong direction for defensive fields of fire, but the small ground floor parlor provided a natural choke point with a window overlooking the eastern approach, the direction from which German movement was most likely. The barn, attached by a narrow passage, offered concealment but not protection. Its thin wooden walls were no match for rifle fire. He moved slowly through the building, recognizing the aftermath of previous occupants. Empty .30 Predator 06 casings in a corner. A broken crate with markings from an American supply line. Blood on the floorboards dried into darkened stains. German boot prints near the back doorway, partially obscured by the footprints of whoever had left before him. Every trace suggested that the farmhouse had already been contested, and that meant it would be contested again. The larger context of the battle offered no reassurance. American lines were bending, not breaking, but the sheer scale of the German advance forced commanders to reposition units faster than information could travel. The 82nd Airborne, tasked with covering a broad front, had become a patchwork network of platoon-sized strongpoints. Relief was possible, but unpredictably timed. Janki understood the implications. A lone paratrooper inside a farmhouse could become a temporary anchor point, a small resistance pocket that slowed enemy progress for minutes or hours. Those minutes mattered in winter warfare. They could allow a regiment to reposition. They could give artillery observers time to re-establish contact. They could disrupt the momentum of an attacking force. He set his rifle down near the window, checked the ammunition in his bandoliers, and adjusted his cold-stiffened gloves. Every sound outside, distant engines, muffled boots, brittle branches cracking under weight, became sharper, more defined. The farmhouse was no longer shelter. It was a battlefield waiting for an enemy to find it. The first sound that broke the stillness was not gunfire. It was vibration. A low, rhythmic tremor traveling through the frozen ground, too steady to be wind, too deliberate to be animal movement. Private First Class Arthur Art Janki remained motionless inside the farmhouse parlor, one gloved hand resting lightly on the stock of his M1 Garand. He had learned long ago that the battlefield announced itself with subtleties before the violence arrived. Every paratrooper who survived Normandy and Holland carried the same instinct: quiet meant movement, and movement meant presence. The tremor faded, replaced by a faint metallic clatter. Snow muffled much of it, but the cadence was unmistakable. Equipment brushing against gear, boots sinking into crusted snow, metal shifting against metal. German infantry moved differently from American units. Their fire teams advanced in a staggered pattern, using terrain as cover even in open fields. Their spacing produced a particular rhythm, uneven, slightly delayed, controlled. Janki recognized that rhythm approaching the farmhouse. He eased into position behind the small parlor window overlooking the eastern field. The glass had been shattered days earlier, leaving jagged fragments along the frame. Snow clung to the edges, like frostbite spreading across stone. Through the opening, he had a narrow but clear view of the tree line 200 yards away. Fir branches sagged beneath a new layer of snow, obscuring anything deeper than 20 feet. The forest appeared still, but the stillness felt pressed over something living. A flicker of motion broke the symmetrical pattern of the branches, a faint shift of white against white, the subtle disturbance of snow being displaced. Then a second movement, slightly lower, synchronizing with the first. German scouts, likely Volksgrenadiers. Their white camouflage smocks blended seamlessly into the ground, turning them into shapes defined more by absence than presence. The farmhouse stood in the exact location an advancing German patrol would probe. It offered shelter, observation, and a foothold close to the American lines. Jonky knew they would not bypass it. They would clear it, and clear it thoroughly. He lowered his breathing, controlled and steady, the way he had been trained. Paratrooper doctrine emphasized the use of every inch of terrain or cover, and a farmhouse window was no different. His right elbow braced against the inner wall, his left palm pressed firmly beneath the rifle's handguard. The Garand felt heavier in the cold, but the weight steadied him, grounded him, reminded him of the rifle's predictable recoil and reliable cycling. He waited. The first German broke from the tree line at a low crouch, moving with measured caution toward the field. A second followed several yards behind. Their discipline showed in their spacing and angles. They swept the field with machine-like thoroughness, but their eyes were fixed on the ridgeline to the north, not the silent farmhouse partially concealed behind a low stone wall. Jonky shifted his rifle, the sight aligning with practiced precision. He allowed the first soldier to advance further, knowing the second posed immediate threat in a firefight. Distance mattered less than timing. Paratroopers learned to shoot for effect, not volume. One shot to change the tempo of the battlefield. He exhaled, the breath drifting as a faint cloud. The M1 Garand cracked once, the sound sharp and violent in the frozen air. The recoil jolted with familiar force. The first German dropped instantly, body folding into the snow without a cry. The second soldier hesitated for half a heartbeat, not enough to recover, before Jonky fired again. The second impact sent the man sprawling backward, rifle sliding out of reach. Silence returned, but it was now a different silence, the kind that follows shock. From the tree line, authoritative shouts muffled by distance indicated the patrol had been larger than the two advance elements. A third shape dove behind a snow mound. A fourth retreated deeper into the trees. Then the forest erupted. Machine gun fire cut across the field in sweeping arcs, striking the farmhouse wall in a violent sequence. Chunks of stone splintered off, scattering fragments across the floor. Bullets punched through the window frame, blasting fragments of wood into the room. The sound filled the parlor with a deep, vibrating hum, the unmistakable reverberation of sustained automatic fire in confined stone spaces. Jonky stayed low, counting the bursts by rhythm. German machine gunners often fired in longer, less disciplined streams compared to American gunners trained on burst control. Their weapon, likely an MG-42, spat rounds with a velocity unmatched by anything else in the war. The barrel's signature scream blended with the metallic ripping of the weapon's feed mechanism, but the machine gunner lacked visibility. The snow obscured the exact placement of the window, and the stone walls absorbed a significant portion of the incoming fire. Jonky shifted position, crawling toward the interior doorway, minimizing his silhouette. He knew the German machine gunner was not the true threat. The riflemen were repositioning. They would attempt a flanking maneuver, approaching the farmhouse from the blind side. They would use grenades first. Standard clearing procedure. He eased through the narrow passage to the barn. The wooden structure offered concealment but little protection. A single bullet could penetrate the walls, yet its position allowed him a clear view of the southern approach, the route any flanking team would likely use. Movement confirmed his suspicion. Two Germans advanced rapidly along the stone wall, using it as cover. One carried a rifle, the other a stick grenade. Snow kicked behind their boots in loose, powdery bursts as they closed the distance. They were fast, faster than most units in deep winter. Veteran troops. Jonky steadied his rifle against a support beam, breath sharp in the cold, vision narrowed to the lane between the barn slats. He fired once. The lead soldier collapsed beside the wall, grenade slipping from his grasp and rolling harmlessly into the snow. The second soldier recoiled, darting behind cover, firing blindly toward the barn. The farmhouse absorbed the initial wave, but the Germans were reorganizing. Their fire became coordinated. Their angles tightened. Their numbers increased. This was no simple patrol anymore. The enemy had identified the farmhouse as an occupied strongpoint, and now they intended to take it. The first contact had passed. The battle for the farmhouse was only beginning. The farmhouse walls had survived the first German surge, but the battle was beginning to change shape. The opening exchanges, the precise shots, the sharp return fire, the flanking attempt, had given way to something heavier. The rhythm of the attack shifted the way winter storms shifted, gradually, then entirely. What had begun as a probing patrol was evolving into a determined assault by a force large enough to overwhelm a lone defender through sheer weight. Inside the farmhouse, Private First Class Arthur Art Janke adjusted his grip on the M1 Garand. He felt the cold more sharply now. The adrenaline spike from the initial firefight had dulled into a steady burn, leaving the deeper cold of the Ardennes creeping through his gloves, into the bones of his hands, into the muscles of his forearms. He rolled his shoulders once, loosening the stiffness, then returned to his firing position along the narrow parlor window. Outside, the field, which had been silent only hours earlier, was now scarred by movement. New footprints crisscrossed the snow. Rifles lay partially buried where men had fallen. A thin haze of gunpowder hung low across the ground, drifting with the wind like smoke from an extinguished candle. But the forest beyond the field had grown darker. German forces were gathering in the tree line, their shapes shifting behind layers of branches heavy with snow. A machine gun opened up again, this time from a more deliberate angle. The MG-42's unmistakable roar stitched a row of bullets across the upper section of the farmhouse wall, shaving stone into powder that floated briefly before settling on the floor in gray dust. The Germans were adjusting their fire with growing precision. They were mapping the building, learning the angles, calibrating their pressure. Janke moved from the parlor to the barn passage, keeping low, head ducked beneath exposed rafters. The Germans had tested the southern approach earlier, and he expected they would try again. Veteran troops rarely abandoned an access route entirely. They waited, probed elsewhere, then returned, when the defenders' attention shifted. The barn creaked under the cold. The wood, already weakened from prior shelling, expanded and contracted unevenly with each gust of wind. Janke pressed himself behind a thick support beam and scanned through the warped slats. The world outside looked distorted, the snow appearing in streaked, narrow lines, the tree line wavering like a mirage. But the distortion didn't hide motion. He counted 4 shapes advancing low along the wall, moving with the disciplined fluidity of trained assault troops. Their spacing was tighter than the earlier team. They carried more equipment, satchels, grenades, and the rigid posture of men who expected resistance. This wasn't reconnaissance anymore, this was clearing doctrine. Janke steadied the Garand against the beam. His breathing slowed, the barrel aligned. When the first German leaned forward to cross the broken section of wall, Janke fired. The man collapsed instantly, gear scattering across the snow. The second soldier hesitated just long enough for Janke to adjust and fire again. The Garand's report echoed through the barn and the field in a deep, controlled rhythm, but the remaining 2 soldiers reacted with speed. One darted behind the wall, spraying suppressive fire toward the barn. Several rounds punched through the thin wood, splintering fragments into the air. Janke covered his face with his forearm, feeling small shards pepper the sleeve of his jacket. The second German lobbed a grenade high toward the farmhouse, the object arcing against the gray sky. Janke withdrew instantly. The grenade detonated along the exterior, sending a dull concussive wave through the building. Dust fell from the rafters, the walls shuddered. Snow from the roof cascaded down in a heavy sheet. The explosion hadn't breached the interior, but it had forced him to reposition, exactly what the attacking team intended. He navigated back toward the parlor, boots crunching lightly on debris. His ears rang faintly from the blast, a dull pulse that made the world sound distant for several seconds. When the ringing faded, he heard the new threat: coordinated movement at the front of the farmhouse, multiple footfalls, metal scraping, gear shifting. The Germans were preparing a simultaneous entry attempt. He dropped to a knee behind the overturned table, using it as partial cover. The parlor window gave him the best angle to delay the entry, but only if he struck fast enough to break their tempo. Through the shattered frame, he saw the first German sprint across the courtyard. Janke fired once. The man tumbled sideways, momentum carrying him into the snow. 3 more advanced immediately behind him. Janke fired again, missed, fired a third time. Hit. The 2 surviving soldiers dove behind the courtyard wall, then advanced in short, aggressive bursts toward the front door. Their coordination tightened, their angles sharpened. They were only meters away now, the distance at which grenades defined the outcome more than rifles. Janke reached instinctively for his last remaining fragmentation grenade. The cold metal felt heavy and absolute in his hand. He pulled the pin, rose briefly from cover, and hurled it through the window with practiced precision. The explosion shook the front of the farmhouse. The blast tore through the courtyard, sending snow, debris and fragments of stone in every direction. The force of it rattled the interior walls, causing loose boards to shift in their frames. When the smoke drifted aside, the courtyard was still. But the silence didn't last. Machine gun fire erupted again from the eastern tree line. Heavier, deeper, more sustained than before. The MG-42's barrel was supported now, likely on a bipod or improvised mount. Its arcs were more deliberate. The rounds punched into the farmhouse with force that chipped stone into fragments and sent vibrations through the floorboards. The Germans had committed a larger element. They weren't trying to flush out a defender anymore. They were trying to eliminate him. Janke felt the shift, not fear, but the cold clarity soldiers understood as the moment a fight moved past the threshold of endurance. His ammunition was no longer plentiful. His cover was degrading. His body, already battered by cold fatigue and recoil, was tightening under the strain. The battle had entered the phase every paratrooper dreaded. The moment when survival depended on minutes, not resources. The farmhouse trembled under another burst. German voices pressed forward. Boots approached through snow. The breaking point had arrived. The assault reached its final phase with the inevitability of a tide. Snow shifted under synchronized German movement as assault elements repositioned for a final push. The farmhouse, once an anonymous stone structure among hundreds, had become a point of friction on a battlefield defined by speed and momentum. To the German force gathering along the eastern tree line, it was a nuisance that disrupted timing. To the 82nd Airborne Division, scattered across miles of frozen farmland, it was an anchor unknowingly holding a thread of their defensive line. Inside the building, Private First Class Arthur Art Janke recognized the moment when the fight surpassed every calculation he had made. The stone walls that had shielded him were fractured. The parlor window frame was shredded beyond recognition. The barn passage lay half-collapsed under debris from the most recent explosion. His ammunition had dwindled to a final handful of en-bloc clips. His gloves, stiffened by cold and soaked with melted snow, clung to his skin. Yet something else had shifted, not inside the farmhouse, but across the distant tree line. The German fire, once relentless, faltered. It did not cease entirely. The MG-42 still sent sporadic bursts toward the farmhouse, but the rhythm had changed. The weapon's arcs no longer stitched across the walls with the same precision. The shouted orders outside carried a note of urgency that had been absent earlier. John Key moved carefully toward the parlor window, staying low, using the fractured stone as partial cover. Through the swirling haze of drifting snow, he saw the pattern that defined the shift. German troops were pulling back, not far, only 50 to 100 yards, but they were withdrawing from their forward assault positions. Some moved in crouched, disciplined steps, others sprinted across the exposed field toward the relative safety of the trees. The covering fire was scattered, almost improvised. This was not a rout, it was a recalibration. Something had forced it. John Key lifted the M1 Garand and scanned the ridgeline to the northwest. There, emerging through the haze, came the unmistakable silhouettes that signaled a turning point in countless Ardennes engagements, the boxy shapes of American armor advancing in column formation, engines rumbling with muffled intensity. The armored vanguard, likely elements of the 3rd Armored Division or Combat Command B, was moving deliberately, with the kind of controlled aggression that indicated they had encountered pockets of German resistance across the sector. Infantry advanced beside the tanks, their dark silhouettes cutting against the white field. Their spacing was disciplined. Their approach was methodical. They swept the terrain with rifles at the ready, scanning for survivors, stragglers, or concealed threats. The farmhouse, battered, scorched, and partially buried under fallen snow, still stood in their path. The German unit retreating through the trees did so with the knowledge that staying would invite artillery or direct tank fire. The farmhouse had cost them time, personnel, and momentum, all of which mattered in a winter offensive built entirely on maintaining speed. Every delay compounded the friction that slowed the larger German advance, and a lone paratrooper had created that delay. John Key remained in place, rifle angled downward, breath steadying as he observed the German withdrawal. No sense of triumph accompanied the moment, only exhaustion, the total consuming kind that seeped into every muscle, tightening the chest, and weighing down the limbs, until even breath felt heavy. He lowered himself against the interior wall, letting the rifle rest across his lap. The farmhouse creaked under the shifting weight of the damaged roof, but it held. Minutes passed before the American forces reached the yard. Their movements outside indicated caution, the kind exercised by soldiers who had approached too many ruined structures, holding too many hidden dangers. Boots crunched cautiously across the courtyard, rifles angled upward, scanning the windows. The barn door shifted under a gentle test. Snow slid from the roof in a quiet sheet. The farmhouse, for the first time since dawn, held silence without threat. When they finally entered, they found the scene exactly as the battle had shaped it: splintered wood, fractured stone, broken furniture, smoke clinging to the air, and a lone paratrooper who had held the structure far longer than circumstances suggested any man could. Records from that day would later describe John Key as calm, though exhaustion radiated from every line of his posture. His uniform bore the grime of combat, layered over the ice of winter. His gloves were torn. His rifle, resting across his lap, appeared almost fused to his hands. The relief force secured the area, sweeping through the barn, the parlor, and the corners of the farmhouse, where shattered glass and debris had gathered. Outside, medics examined both American and German casualties, scattered across the field. The snow had already begun to claim them, drifting into crevices, softening outlines, erasing details. That was the nature of December 1944. The battlefield itself absorbed memory before history could record it. But the farmhouse incident did not disappear. Commanders noted the engagement as one of several isolated stands that slowed German progress across key sectors. Intelligence officers pieced together the timeline using field reports, footprints, cartridge cases, and scattered fragments of equipment. The conclusion was simple but significant. A lone American paratrooper had held a tactically valuable structure against a superior German force long enough to allow U.S. armor to re-establish a coherent line across the sector. The broader battle surged on without pause. The Ardennes offensive continued for weeks. Towns changed hands multiple times. Units disappeared into fog and re-emerged days later. But within the larger chaos, the small fights mattered. the single intersections held, the crossroads defended, the farmhouses occupied by 1 or 2 men who refused to abandon ground. Johnke's stand was one of those fights. It did not alter the trajectory of the entire offensive, but it shaped the immediate battlefield around him in the precise moment it mattered most. In winter warfare, delays measured in minutes could influence movements measured in miles, and the farmhouse, battered, cracked, still standing, became a symbol of those minutes won. For the 82nd Airborne Division, the farmhouse stood as an unofficial testament to the division's ethos: hold fast, no matter the circumstances, no matter the isolation, no matter the odds. Paratroopers were trained to fight alone if necessary, to use terrain with creativity, to convert adversity into endurance. Years after the war, the farmhouse still bore marks on its stone, faint impact scars from bullets and fragments buried in the walls. Locals spoke of the battle the way rural communities often recall wartime events, not through dramatization, but through quiet acknowledgement. Snow had fallen heavily that winter. A young American had held the building alone. The Germans had tried to take it. They had failed, and that was enough. The Ardennes would be remembered for Bastogne, for the armored clashes near St. Vith, for the massive shifts in strategic momentum, but within its frozen fields lay dozens of stories of endurance that never reached headlines. The farmhouse was one of them, a microcosm of a larger truth. The outcome of a great battle can hinge on the actions of a single soldier who refuses to yield ground. And in December 1944, in a lonely Belgian farmhouse, choked by winter, Arthur Johnke proved that truth in the only way a paratrooper could, by holding until relief arrived, no matter how